in terms of the short-term uncertainty driving a lot of panic in the industry. Before it even hits the consumer, of course, it's going to hit the producer.
Welcome back to this week's Car-Pinionated. A quick note before the show, we recorded this on Thursday, and it's an ever-changing situation with the tariffs. So even between the time we recorded it and now, which is Saturday, things have changed. So things might continue to change, but the basics of what we talked about are still the same. So on with the show. Welcome back to Car-Pinionated, our weekly show on cars, the car industry, and driving in general. You'll notice that Glenn and Jeff aren't here this week, but we wanted to talk about the big news in the automotive industry, which are the tariffs for Mexico and Canada, and to a slightly lesser degree, China, and the impact that has on the car industry. And it's a huge impact. So we're joined by Dr. Purba Mukerji from Connecticut College, and she will talk to us about the tariffs and what impact they're going to have. Welcome to Car-Pinionated. So first off, can you explain a little bit about what tariffs are and what their impact is?
So tariffs are a tax on anyone who wants to sell in American markets and happens to produce abroad. And so this tax is on the books paid by the person or the company that's selling to the US, but in actual fact, a lot of times these can be passed on to the consumer in the form of higher prices. So you asked about the impact on the automobile industry in the US. The impact is going to be felt depending on how they produce. So there are companies like Volkswagen who produce a huge amount, 2/3 of their production is in Mexico. So they're going to be affected more compared to, say, Ford or GM, who produce about 25% abroad. So it depends on how much you produce abroad. And then once you try to bring the production back, which seems to be the ultimate aim of these tariffs, then you're going to have to figure out what the cost of production will be here. And there are all kinds of estimates of that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and building a car plant is at least a 2-year process and $1 billion, and it's not something that happens overnight. And that what the automakers have said is, like, we're in a long range industry. We plan out, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 10 years down the road, and they can turn quickly, as we saw during the pandemic, but there's still a lot of factors here. You mentioned Ford and GM. Stellantis also produces a lot of cars in Canada. Um, isn't there also an issue about, we don't know how this is all going to play out, but some parts go back and forth?
Absolutely. There's the parts industry, which is a very interesting part, of the whole story, because in the parts industry, the biggest profits are made by the software side and semiconductors, whereas the other parts are very low profit, kind of very small profit margin industries. So as these come back, we have very vertically integrated companies like Tesla, famously produces almost all of its parts in the US. So when we think about the consumer, the other side of the automobile industry, we could see higher prices depending on how this unfolds. And you talked about the long term, and that's very interesting in this context because there is a sea change coming in manufacturing. Now, whenever plants are set up, a lot of them are very mechanized by robotics, by AI. And so on the flip side of this, on a positive side of this, one could see more of that coming into the US, that kind of investment, and that will prepare our young people and our labor force in general to work with this new age of technology. So there is that aspect as well.
And can you talk a little bit about the history of the it's now called the MCA, right? But it used to be NAFTA, and that changed the dynamics of auto manufacturing in this region of the world, right?
Absolutely. And I think that I would urge people to go back a little bit further than even NAFTA that came into being in the 1990s, because one thing that is not talked about at all, I find, in the public sphere is what the US has done, which is so completely different from the rest of the world. Since the end of the Second World War, the US has opened its markets in a big way to everybody in the world. And that is very unusual. Even Europe hasn't done it. So, under the World Trade Organization, for example, and the GATT before that, we opened up progressively our markets and we said no one else has to open up. We are the front runner of this. We will show the world how free trade is done. And we went ahead and did that. So initially, the idea was that we would open up, industries that are more agricultural and keep the manufacturing closed, And we were trying to protect our industries that we thought we were good at towards the beginning. But as it turns out, even in the 1970s, there was enough research to indicate that we had great competition in even the things that we thought we were very good at, like manufacturing. And then with the entry of the heavyweights like China and then NAFTA, as you mentioned, in the 1990s, things really changed. So the way that our economy has developed, the hollowing out of manufacturing in the automobile industry, for example, very illustrative case there, comes from that huge push towards producing abroad in Mexico and even in Canada, and especially in Mexico, to avail of the cheaper labor prices. And as I was saying, as manufacturing is changing, and as these industries, particularly automotive, think in the long term, I think it will. There is a path here to make that adjustment to bring that manufacturing home. I'm not saying that success is guaranteed. Success is a coin toss in the real world. But this is a very interesting moment. And when people talk about the US putting tariffs, and we know tariffs hurt consumers and so on, I think a little bit of the backstory also needs to be acknowledged about just how open the US has been and how that has affected consumers positively, bringing us really cheap goods from abroad, but also how that's affected jobs in the United States. No other worker except the American worker is so very exposed to international competition. All countries have protected their workers, and we have not, and that has made our economy the way it is today. That has made our labor force the way it is today, and that's something important to keep in mind, in my
And
opinion.
you talk about protecting the worker, but it still comes back to the way I see it is that in this short term, month to month situation where the tariffs were supposed to take place the February 4th, and that was pushed off a month, and that then it was supposed to be March 4th, and then it was 25% for Mexico and Canada, and but now with the car makers, the automotive manufacturers are exempt from that, and that sort of uh, process or uh, kind of chaotic, what's going to happen next is really
Yes.
hard for manufacturers in general, but specifically for car makers who are dealing in long-term issues. I mean, where their thinking is not, you know, can't be, changed in a couple months, right?
Absolutely. I think you have nailed it with the uncertainty in policies. And so at the start of all of this, at the start of President Trump's term, I was of the opinion, and I have perhaps been proven wrong in that, but my opinion was that all of this is about negotiations. So for example, with Canada and Mexico, it's about controlling the trafficking, human trafficking, drug trafficking. And now there are also these possibilities of perhaps really putting this in place, this kind of 1 month reprieve, and then this thing goes ahead. I think this has been done before. This, of course, in terms of years. So there have been years of reprieve in international trade of these tariffs that are going to come on, and you just have to adjust to that. And then you find that industries don't adjust because they figure by the time is up, they will make so much noise that again the political the political players will be forced to continue with business as usual. So I think that you're absolutely right. We have to wait and watch, and we have to see where this is going. In terms of the consumers, just if this thing does go through, even for the automotive industry, I wonder how much of a price increase we'll see, because there is a lot of overcapacity, it seems, in the automobile industry, and lots of cars out there in the lots. So it's an open question how much of that will be passed on to the consumers, at least in the short term.
Yeah, and the thing that when it comes back to consumers is that car prices are already high, right? That the average car price is in the upper $40,000 range,
Yeah.
and um, what happened during the pandemic was that car makers built the more expensive versions of the more expensive vehicles, right? And so then you have the other side of that, which is, the reticence of the consumer to pay more money. And now you're asking the consumer to pay more money, right? And it just keeps layering up. And so do you ultimately hurt the bigger car industry? Um, if you bring manufacturing back to America, wages are going to be more, costs are going to be more. That gets obviously, that's business. They pass it along to the consumer. And it just seems to me to be counterintuitive that you have these goals and you're managing it this way, but the pain is felt, you know, by the people. I don't know. I don't see that process as being helpful in the long term. Because
Right.
at the end of the day, we in 2008 when we're faced with major corporate GM, Stellantis, what was then now is Stellantis, Chrysler, corporation, facing bankruptcy, the government stepped in and gave loan guarantees and things like that, which worked out fine. They were paid back, and you go back to the late 70s and early 80s. Well, the early 80s with Chrysler being bailed out, they paid back those with interest. At the tendrils of the automotive industry go deep in American manufacturing.
Mhm. Yes.
You don't always think about Connecticut, let's say, having uh, an automotive industry, but there's, I'm sure, parts of the companies in Connecticut that produce it. You have dealers, and it just, I I I am concerned about the long-term implications of a short-term change. I guess that's my bottom line there.
Right. And I think that you're absolutely right in terms of the short-term uncertainty driving a lot of panic in the industry. Before it even hits the consumer, of course, it's going to hit the producer, and they have to decide which way they're going to swing, how they're going to manage this. But I think in the long term, things are so much up in the air in manufacturing in general, particularly in automobiles. If you look at during the pandemic or towards the end of it, if we're thinking 2022 and around that time, if you look at the manufacturing plants that were set up in the automobile industry, particularly in China and in Mexico and across the world, about a quarter were completely new technology. So this is, the AI and robotics kind of technology. And so given this upheaval that's coming, a lot of these car manufacturers anyway have to build new factories, or refit their factories to these new conditions. So I think at least that gives them a window of opportunity to be more flexible here, which is unusual in their industry. But how this plays out politically and how these policies are solidified, because I think that a lot of people out there still do think that for President Trump, this is more of a negotiating chip. Probably, maybe these won't go into effect. Maybe the automobile industry will be completely exempt. Once we have a clearer picture of what's going on, I think that I am more of an optimist about how this will turn out because of two reasons. One, the American consumer has a lot of power here because people are already tired of the high prices. And so, in terms of having a whole lot of market power to pass on these costs to the consumer, I think the US is not ready, is not that kind of market. And so a lot of this has to be borne by the producer. And since producers themselves are kind of in flux, they have that flexibility to potentially thinking about bringing this manufacturing home. But again, I recognize that I am more of an optimist in this because I see these things aligning in a very interesting way. And I keep in mind also the longer term, more backward looking perspective that what US has done is just so unusual that this kind of going back um, is almost to be expected. If you do something so unusual in the world scenario, in international trade, when we teach it in textbooks in college, we talk about how this is this prisoner's dilemma kind of game. You just want to put on as many tariffs as possible on other countries. And the US has shown us the way out of that. But not a whole lot of countries have followed, and they're kind of entrenched in their own tariffs as well. So this is something that is a long time in the making. And the reason for my optimism is that the consumers are protected by the fact that there is that tiredness of paying so much for cars already built in. And producers, to a certain extent, are protected by the fact that things have to change anyway. So they could mold the change in this direction. So interesting things are coming together in the market right now.
Yeah.
But I completely recognize your point of view. The uncertainty is very dangerous.
I think it's also interesting, and you touched on this a little bit, is the is how little, with the exception of probably Canada and Mexico, how little automotive we export. How much of there's Ford of Europe, there used to be GM of Europe, but Stellantis is a global company. Ford and GM are also global companies too. Um,
And
and
BMW
so
and Mercedes too. I believe they produce in the US and
right,
export.
right. Well, no, well, right. There are certain models that do get exported, but what I'm
Yeah,
talking about in the big picture is like,
absolutely. Yeah.
your Ford F-150s are not, there's not boats and boats of them heading over to the, you know, tour France,
You're
let's
right.
say,
Right. Yeah.
because that would just be terrible. Um, no one would ever
Clog
find a
up their
parking space.
roads.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And the Japanese domestic market has never been open, welcoming, uh, where they've sold any degree of American cars. Um,
Right.
and so you can say that around the world, Australia, other areas, South America, they tend to have their own, kind of auto industry, and so we bring in more than we, you know, export. Uh,
Absolutely. And
but
our
we're also selling enough to our own. people,
Yes,
you know.
exactly. That's the point I was going to make. Our car industry, the consumer base is so huge, 16 million cars.
Mhm.
So it's huge and it's always been very, very large. You can go back to the all the way to the 1970s. We are a huge consumer of cars all across the world. We set the trend. That's why Ford F-150 is among the top selling cars in the world because we are a top market. And the point you're making is, it's not sold a whole lot abroad,
Mhm.
but
Yeah.
but there it is. So we are definitely the trendsetters. We are the industry in terms of the market. And it's interesting in economics, there's this theoretical concept of optimal tariff. If you're this big, there is a tariff that you should put. Because if you don't put any tariffs at all, free trade is not the ideal in that situation, which is a great exception in international trade theory, because otherwise, for all other countries, free trade is the best policy.
Mhm.
But for a big country like the United States, actually, optimal tariff could be a much better outcome for society. But that's all in the textbooks.
Yeah. Can we
Real
talk a
world,
little? I'm sorry, go
yeah.
ahead.
Oh no, you were going to ask.
I was gonna we haven't really touched on China.
Yeah.
And so the Chinese car manufacturing situation, you had a lot of American manufacturers set up partnerships and manufacturing assembly uh in in China. The Lincoln Corsair, Nautilus, I forget which one of those, is built in China, and you have several Buicks that are imported. Um, so what I find then interesting is, so we've had for a number of years into the Biden administration 100% um, a tariff on Chinese-made electric cars, and kind of block the market to that, where what's happening in Mexico and what's happening in Europe is those Chinese cars are coming in, and they're pushing out the rest of the market in certain areas, and certainly the electric space. What do you think about what do you think about that, and what are we going to see with the additional Chinese tariffs on a wider variety of cars?
Right. I think to go back to the negotiating, card kind of using tariffs for that, I think that one of the things that has been talked about is China setting up, BYD, for example, trying to set up manufacturing in Mexico and then using our free trade zone to kind of potentially down the road bringing in those cars into the United States at a lower tariff or no tariff at all if they can manage it. And
Mhm.
so that's one of the reasons for having a tariff in a free trade zone to kind of protect from that kind of cheating going on. And I think that again is more shining the light on what is happening. And that's happening in Europe as well. For China to come in stealth mode, come in, set up manufacturing, and then sell to the entire Eurozone. I think that as China's retort to our tariff threats has been muted, as we all know. Although they have tried to hurt German manufacturing, I think, in the United States with their very targeted large engine SUV tariffs, which are potentially going to hurt BMW and Mercedes more
And
than
you're talking
anything.
about selling those cars in China?
Yes,
Okay.
exactly. Yeah, yeah. Because German SUV, there is a bit of a hub here in North America, and so those have been targeted, and so this kind of tit for tat can go on. But I think the bigger picture is exactly what you're saying. This competition in the electric vehicle space from these huge wholesale manufacturing, heavyweight like China, very cheap manufacturing, and how do we face up to that competition, and how do we prevent, I think, in the bigger picture, any kind of advantage being taken of our markets. It's one thing to allow a certain amount of open free trade going on in the world, but it's quite another to try and monitor how the loopholes in the system are then used. And I think this tariff on Mexico particularly is also aimed at that.
I want to close out here, but I do want to mention one of the most famous tariffs of all time in the automotive industry is the chicken tax.
Oh,
And
yes.
and as a to briefly summarize it, they they didn't allow pickup trucks to be
Yes,
brought into the country
exactly.
without a 25% tax, which ends up then meaning,
Hurting them, which was just,
yeah,
uh,
um, it's fascinating. Uh, anyway, uh, thank you so much for your time, Doctor. I've appreciate you taking the time to talk to us about this. And that'll be it for this week. We will see you again next time.